The phone call came at 2:17 a.m. on January 6, 1977. Frank Sinatra was in his Palm Springs compound, sleeping fitfully after a late dinner with friends. The ringing cut through the desert silence like a knife. He knew before he answered. You always know when a call comes at that hour. Your body understands before your mind catches up. Mr. Sinatra, this is Captain Rodriguez with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about your mother, Dolly Sinatra. Sir, there's been an accident. Frank's hand tightened on the receiver. What kind of accident? Sir, the chartered plane carrying your mother from Palm Springs to Las Vegas. We've lost contact. The plane went down in the San Bernardino Mountains. Search and rescue teams are being deployed, but the weather conditions are severe. I'm very sorry, sir. Frank didn't remember hanging up. He didn't remember calling his daughters. He didn't remember the next hours. Later, people would tell him he made calls, gave instructions, contacted lawyers and aviation authorities. But Frank remembered none of it. He was somewhere else entirely, back in Hoboken, a skinny kid watching his mother Dolly navigate the neighborhood with the kind of strength that made grown men step aside. Dolly Sinatra wasn't just Frank's mother. She was his first manager, his fiercest defender, his toughest critic. She'd forced saloon owners to let her teenage son sing. She'd fought the neighbors who said Francis Albert would never amount to anything. She'd worked as a midwife, delivered hundreds of babies, saved the money that eventually sent Frank to New York to pursue his dream. And now she was gone, somewhere on that frozen mountainside, in twisted metal and snow. The search took 3 days. 3 days of Frank pacing his compound, chain-smoking, staring at phones that never rang with good news. 3 days of hoping maybe she'd survived, maybe she was hurt, but alive, maybe search and rescue would find her in time. On January 9, 1977, they found the wreckage. There were no survivors. Dolly Sinatra, age 82, was dead. Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, the man who'd sung to presidents and kings, who'd commanded stages across the world, collapsed. Not physically, but something inside him broke in a way that people who knew him had never seen before. The funeral was scheduled for January 12, 1977, at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills. It would be a massive event. Dolly had been a celebrity in her own right, appearing on television with Frank, beloved by his fans, known throughout the entertainment world. The church would be packed. Media would be everywhere. Photographers, reporters, cameras, all waiting to capture Frank Sinatra's grief. Frank couldn't do it. He couldn't face the spectacle. He couldn't perform grief for the cameras. He couldn't stand at a podium and deliver a eulogy while flashbulbs exploded and journalists scribbled notes. His mother deserved better than that. His grief was too private, too raw, too overwhelming to be turned into entertainment. 2 days before the funeral, Frank called Dean Martin. It was 11 p.m. Dean was at home, reading in bed. The phone rang, and Dean knew immediately something was wrong. Frank never called this late unless it was serious. Diner, Frank, how you holding up? Silence. Then Frank's voice cracked and small. I can't go to the funeral. I can't do it, Dean. The media, the cameras, the whole goddamn circus. My mother, she wouldn't have wanted that, but I need to be there. I need to say goodbye. I don't know how. Dean sat up in bed. What do you need? I don't know. I just know I can't walk into that church with 1,000 people watching me cry. I can't turn my mother's funeral into a Frank Sinatra show. Then don't. What? Don't go to the funeral. Go before. Frank was quiet, processing. Before? Yeah. Before anyone else is there, before the media sets up, before it becomes a circus, you and me, we'll go early, real early. You say goodbye, Private. Then the official funeral happens and you don't have to be there. I'll speak for you. I'll represent you, but you get your moment without cameras. Frank's voice broke. Dean, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm telling you, that's what we're doing. What time do you want me to pick you up? The morning of January 11th, 1977, Dean Martin's car pulled up to Frank Sinatra's compound at 4:47 a.m. It was still dark. The desert was quiet except for the wind. Dean got out, walked to Frank's door, and knocked once. Frank answered immediately. He was dressed in a black suit, looking hollow and exhausted. His eyes were red from crying and not sleeping. This wasn't chairman of the board Frank Sinatra. This was Francis Albert Sinatra from Hoboken, New Jersey, who just lost his mother. "You ready?" Dean asked quietly. Frank nodded. They walked to Dean's car in silence and drove toward Los Angeles. Neither of them spoke for the first 30 minutes. The sun wasn't up yet. The highway was empty. They were just two men in a car, heading toward a cemetery where one of them would say goodbye to the person who'd made him possible. Finally, Frank spoke. "She was supposed to stay in Palm Springs. I told her to stay, but she wanted to go to Vegas to see some friends. She said, 'Francis, I'm 82 years old. I'll do what I want.' That was the last thing she said to me. 'I'll do what I want.'" Dean kept his eyes on the road. "Sounds like Dolly." "Yeah." Frank's voice cracked. "That was her, right to the end, tough as nails, wouldn't listen to anyone." "You got that from her?" Frank almost smiled. "Yeah, I did." Then the tears came. "Dean, I don't know how to do this. How do you bury your mother? How do you put the person who gave you life into the ground? How do you walk away from that grave and just keep going?" Dean didn't have an answer. There wasn't an answer, so he just said, "1 minute at a time. That's all you can do. 1 minute, then another minute, then another. You don't think about tomorrow, or next week, or next year. You just get through the next minute." They reached Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City at 5:43 a.m. The sun was just starting to lighten the eastern sky. The cemetery was empty, except for a groundskeeper in the distance who didn't even look up as Dean's car entered. Dean drove slowly through the grounds until they found the Sinatra family plot. Frank's father, Marty, was buried there. Now Dolly would join him. The grave had been prepared the day before, a dark rectangle of earth next to Marty's headstone, waiting. Dean parked. Neither man moved for a moment. Then Frank opened his door and stepped out. Dean got out on the driver's side, but hung back, giving Frank space. Frank walked slowly to the grave and stood at its edge, looking down into the darkness. The morning air was cold. Birds were starting to wake up. In the distance, Los Angeles was beginning to stir, but here in this cemetery, it felt like the only two people in the world were Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. Frank stood there for a long time, not speaking, just standing. Dean stayed by the car, 20 feet away, far enough to give Frank privacy, but close enough if Frank needed him. Then Frank started talking. Dean couldn't hear the words. Frank was speaking quietly, intimately, words meant only for Dolly. But Dean could see Frank's shoulders shaking, could see him wipe his eyes, could see him gesturing occasionally, like he was having a conversation, telling his mother things he needed to say. This went on for an hour. Frank talking, crying, standing, kneeling at the edge of the grave, standing again. Working through grief the only way you can, by feeling it completely, by not hiding from it, by letting it pour out of you in a place where no one was watching, no one was judging, no one was taking pictures. Dean never moved. He stood by the car the entire time, a silent presence, not intruding, not offering comfort, just being there, because sometimes that's all friendship is, presence without performance. Finally, as the sun came fully up, Frank walked back to the car. His face was red and swollen from crying. His eyes looked emptied out, but there was also something else, a kind of peace, or at least the beginning of peace. He'd said what he needed to say. He'd had his moment. Dean opened the passenger door for him. Frank got in without speaking. Dean got in the driver's side, started the car, and they left the cemetery. They drove in silence for 10 minutes before Frank spoke. "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me." "Yeah, I do. You gave me privacy. You gave me my mother back for an hour. Not Dolly Sinatra, the celebrity. Not Frank Sinatra's mother. Just my mum. Just me and her. That's a gift, Dean. Thank you." Dean nodded. "Where do you want to go?" "Home. I can't be at that funeral. I can't do the performance, but I need you to be there. I need you to speak for me. Tell them I love my mother. Tell them I wanted to be there but couldn't. Tell them whatever you need to tell them. I'll handle it. I know you will. That's why I called you." The official funeral took place at 11 a.m. on January 12, 1977. The Church of the Good Shepherd was packed with over 500 people. Celebrities, family, friends, People from Hoboken who'd known Dolly for decades. Outside, photographers and television cameras were everywhere. It was exactly the circus Frank had feared. Frank Sinatra was not in attendance. His absence was noted immediately. Whispers went through the church. "Where's Frank? How can he not be at his own mother's funeral?" Some people were sympathetic. Others were scandalized. Frank Sinatra, too much of a star to attend his own mother's funeral. What kind of son does that? Dean Martin arrived alone, dressed in a black suit, looking somber. He took a seat in the front row with Frank's daughters Nancy, Tina, and Frank Jr. They knew where their father had been that morning. They understood. When it came time for the eulogy, Dean walked to the podium. The church went quiet. Television cameras rolled. Photographers' flashbulbs popped. Dean looked out at the crowd with an expression that said, "Be respectful or leave." "Thank you all for being here today to honor Dolly Sinatra. I know many of you expected to see Frank standing here. I know his absence has raised questions, so let me address that directly." Dean paused, letting the room settle into complete silence. "Frank isn't here today because his grief is too private, too personal, too deep to share with a room full of people and cameras. His mother didn't raise him to perform his sadness for an audience. She raised him to be genuine, to be real. And the realest thing Frank could do today was to mourn privately, in his own way, on his own terms." Someone in the audience started to object, but Dean's look silenced them. But Frank was here. "Yesterday morning at dawn, before any of you arrived, before the media set up their cameras, Frank came to this cemetery. He came to his mother's grave, and he spent an hour with her, alone, saying the things a son needs to say to his mother, crying the tears that should be private, having the conversation that doesn't need witnesses." Dean's voice was firm, protective. "I was with him, not to record it, not to report it, but to be there if he needed me. And I'm telling you now because I want you to understand. Frank Sinatra loved his mother more than any of you can possibly imagine. Dolly made Frank possible. She believed in him when no one else did. She fought for him. She sacrificed for him. And yesterday morning, Frank honored that by refusing to turn his grief into entertainment." The church was absolutely silent now. People were crying. Even the cynics who'd arrived ready to judge Frank were reconsidering. Dean continued, "So Frank asked me to speak for him today. He asked me to tell you that he loved Dolly Sinatra with every fiber of his being, that losing her is a loss he'll carry for the rest of his life, that he will miss her every single day, and that he hopes you understand why he couldn't be here, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much." Dean looked directly at the television cameras, and to the press, to the people who will write stories questioning Frank's absence. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Frank Sinatra was a better son to Dolly than most people could ever hope to be. He just refused to perform that devotion for your cameras, and I, for one, respect him for that." Dean stepped back from the podium. The church erupted in applause, unusual at a funeral, but this wasn't about religious protocol anymore. This was about defending a friend. This was about setting the record straight. The rest of the funeral proceeded normally. Prayers were said, hymns were sung, people paid their respects. But the story everyone remembered was Dean's speech. Within hours, it was being reported on the news. Dean Martin explains Frank Sinatra's absence at Mother's funeral. The coverage was surprisingly sympathetic. Dean had reframed the narrative from "Frank didn't show up" to "Frank mourned privately," which took more courage. After the funeral, Dean drove straight to Frank's compound. Frank was sitting by his pool, still in the black suit from that morning's private visit, smoking a cigarette, staring at nothing. Dean sat down next to him without speaking. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Frank said, "Thank you for what you said, for protecting me. I didn't protect you, I just told the truth." "Same thing." Frank crushed out his cigarette. "Did they understand?" "Most of them, the ones who matter. Your daughters understood. Your real friends understood. Everyone else can go to hell." Frank nodded slowly. "Then you know what the worst part is? The guilt. I know logically it wasn't my fault. The plane crash, the weather, nothing I could have controlled. But I still feel like I should have stopped her, should have insisted she stay in Palm Springs, should have flown her myself, should have something. That's not guilt. That's grief pretending to be guilt. You didn't kill your mother, Frank. A plane crash did. A random, horrible accident. You couldn't have stopped it any more than you could have stopped the weather. I know that in my head, but my heart doesn't know it. Give it time. Your heart will catch up eventually." They sat in silence again. The sun was setting over Palm Springs, painting the desert in oranges and purples, beautiful and indifferent to human suffering. "Dean," Frank said finally, "that hour at the cemetery this morning, that was the most important hour of my life, more important than any performance, any recording, any award. That hour was just me and my mother. No audience, no cameras, no performance, just goodbye. You gave me that. I'll never forget it. You'd have done the same for me." Yeah, I would have. In the weeks that followed, Frank slowly returned to life. He didn't perform for 2 months. He stayed in Palm Springs, grieving privately, processing the loss. His friends visited. Dean came by several times, never staying long, never pushing Frank to talk, just being present. Sammy called every few days. Nancy and the kids checked in constantly. The story of what Dean had done, taking Frank to the cemetery before dawn, giving him privacy, then defending him at the funeral, spread through Hollywood. It became one of those legendary Rat Pack stories, but not the fun kind. This was the kind that showed what their friendship actually meant when it mattered. In March 1977, Frank returned to performing. His first show back was at Carnegie Hall. Dean was in the audience. During the show, Frank paused and said into the microphone, "Some of you know, I lost my mother in January. It was the hardest thing I've ever gone through, and I want to thank someone who was there for me, in a way that probably saved me. Dean Martin is here tonight. Dean, stand up." Dean shook his head, trying to stay seated, but the audience was already applauding. Finally, Dean stood reluctantly. Frank continued, "Dean did something for me that I'll never forget. He gave me the gift of private grief. He let me say goodbye to my mother without cameras, without media, without performance. And then he stood up at her funeral and defended my absence. He told the truth about why I couldn't be there. That took guts. That took friendship. Dean, thank you." The applause was thunderous. Dean nodded once, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, and sat down. But Frank wasn't done. "You know what real friendship is. It's not the parties or the laughs or the good times, though we've had plenty of those. Real friendship is standing in a cemetery at 5 in the morning while your friend falls apart. Real friendship is speaking for someone when they can't speak for themselves. Real friendship is protecting someone's grief from becoming a spectacle. That's what Dean did for me, and I wanted you all to know it." After the show, backstage, Dean found Frank in his dressing room. "You didn't have to do that. The speech." "Yeah, I did. People should know what you did. I didn't do anything special. I just showed up." Frank looked at Dean seriously. "Dean, you don't understand. Showing up is everything. That's the whole thing. Showing up when someone needs you. Being there without needing credit or recognition or thanks. Just being there. That's what separates real friends from everyone else." Dean sat down, lit a cigarette. "Your mother would have been proud of you, Frank. The way you handled this, mourning on your own terms, not letting the media turn it into a circus, that took strength. She taught me that. Be strong. Don't let them see you weak. Control the narrative." Frank smiled sadly. "But you know what? For that 1 hour at the cemetery, I let myself be weak. I cried like a child. I begged the ground to give her back. I said things no one should ever hear. And you stood there and let me. You didn't try to fix it. You didn't try to comfort me. You just let me be broken. That was the gift. Sometimes people need permission to fall apart." "Yeah, and you gave me that permission." Years later, in 1982, Dean's son Dino died in a plane crash. The circumstances were eerily similar to Dolly's death. A plane going down in mountains, search and rescue, the terrible waiting, then the finality. Frank Sinatra showed up at Dean's house the morning after they found the wreckage. Dean opened the door. Frank didn't say anything. He just said, "Where do you need to go?" Dean understood immediately. Forest lawn. Before the funeral, before everyone else. "What time?" "Early, real early." Frank nodded. "I'll pick you up at 5 a.m. And he did. 2 friends, reversing roles, giving each other the same gift, privacy in grief, permission to fall apart, presence without performance. The morning they drove to Forest Lawn, Neither of them mentioned the parallel to that morning in 1977. They didn't need to. The experience was encoded in their friendship now, part of the unspoken language they shared. Frank stood with Dean at Dino's grave for 2 hours, just standing, not talking, not offering platitudes, just being there, because that's what they did for each other. That's what their friendship meant. When Dean gave the eulogy at his son's funeral, struggling through tears, Frank was in the front row, visible, present, a reminder that Dean wasn't alone, that someone understood the impossible weight of burying your child. After the funeral, as they drove back to Dean's house, Dean said quietly, "Thank you for this morning, for being there. You gave me the same gift once. I never forgot it. We're even then." "No," Frank said, "we're not even. We're family. You don't keep score with family." The story of that January morning in 1977, Frank Sinatra unable to attend his mother's funeral, Dean Martin taking him to the cemetery before dawn, giving him private time to grieve, became one of the defining stories of their friendship. Not the glamorous stories of performances and parties, but this quiet, painful, profoundly human moment. It illustrated something crucial about real friendship, that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is give them space to be weak, to fall apart, to grieve without performance, to be fully human without fear of judgment. Dean Martin gave Frank Sinatra that space, and then he protected it, standing up at Dolly's funeral and explaining to the world why Frank's absence was actually the most respectful thing he could have done. That's not just friendship, that's brotherhood. That's understanding someone so completely that you know what they need before they can articulate it. That's being willing to shield someone from the world's judgment, to take the criticism yourself, to stand between your friend and the people who don't understand. When Frank Sinatra died in 1998, Dean had already been gone for 3 years. But at Frank's funeral, Nancy Sinatra told the story of that January morning in 1970. She told how Dean had driven her father to the cemetery, given him privacy with Dolly, then defended him at the funeral. "That's who Dean Martin really was," Nancy said. "Not the cool guy from television, not the drunk act from the Rat Pack shows. The real Dean was the man who showed up at 4:47 a.m. to drive his grieving friend to a cemetery, who stood by a car for an hour while his friend fell apart, who then protected that friend's grief from becoming a media circus. That's the Dean Martin I'll always remember." The lesson of that January morning endures. Real friendship isn't about the good times. It's about showing up for the impossible moments. It's about giving someone permission to be vulnerable. It's about protecting their grief from people who would turn it into entertainment. Dean Martin did that for Frank Sinatra, and years later Frank returned the favor. That's brotherhood. That's love. That's what it means to truly be there for someone when they need you most, not with words or gestures, but with simple, quiet, powerful presence. On a cold January morning in 1977, at a cemetery before dawn, 2 of the most famous men in the world were just 2 friends. One grieving, one witnessing, one falling apart, one holding space. No cameras, no audience, no performance, just human beings doing the hardest thing humans have to do, saying goodbye to someone irreplaceable. And in that moment, Dean Martin gave Frank Sinatra the greatest gift one person can give another: dignity in devastation, privacy in pain, permission to grieve without shame. That's the real story, not the headlines or the speculation or the judgment. Just 2 men, a cemetery at dawn, and the kind of friendship that doesn't need witnesses to be real.